Now, cash-strapped South Africans have been thrown a lifeline. Government has suspended anti-dumping duties on imported chicken. Poultry from Brazil, Spain, Poland, Ireland and Denmark will be exempted for 12 months. The Association of Meat Importers and Exporters say the suspension is a big win for consumers. Let's discuss this now with the association's Paul Matthew. Paul, very good afternoon. Thank you so much for joining us. Why do you say it's a big win?
Good afternoon, and thank you for having us on. Yes, I think it's a huge win, in fact, for the South African consumer. So if we want to put it into context, is that when a duty is applied, especially an anti-dumping duty, what it allows is the local producers to actually match that percentage onto their own prices, which honestly then feeds into the retail sector, and which as African consumers, we have to carry that cost. So the fact there has now been suspension on these anti-dumping duties, mainly out of Brazil, Spain, Poland and Denmark, we should now see a bit of a relief in the price of bone-in chicken.
Okay, so it could be, maybe, we'll see, a relief for consumers, but the Poultry Association, or those who are poultry producers in South Africa, will be looking at this maybe not as cheerfully as you are.
No, absolutely. And, you know, there's an old saying, there's always two sides to a story. So I think what we need to understand, first of all, is that the general duty of 62% still applies. So that was a duty that was it came into effect in March of 2021. So that is still there, which obviously has had a big impact on imported frozen poultry from our international partners. So they were seeking more protection, and obviously they brought on this investigation. But I think one also needs to have a look and say that although Minister Patel, I wouldn't say adhere to our calling, because we were asking the minister to give consideration to dropping all duties for a period of 3 years, very much what's happened in Mexico, the Philippines and South Korea, where they've actually dropped all import duties to assist the consumer. So I think Minister Patel has said, okay, because of the current economic situation, let's give a 12-month sort of grace period on this. But I think one needs to ask the question, if that in terms of the investigation, and we always said from the outset that we did not believe there was material injury to the local producers. And one's got to ask, has the investigation come up with that? And obviously that hasn't been disclosed publicly. We haven't seen the final report or recommendations made to the minister, but one's got to ask that question. So were the local guys seeking more protection to assist their bottom line, to give more dividends to the shareholders? Or has the minister really come to the fore and said, okay, fine, we want to help the SA consumer? But at the end of the day, whatever the outcome may be, this is still a great win for the consumer in terms of reduction in bone and chicken.
Look, I mean, the local producers are saying that this may hurt job creation and put the local industry at great risk. Just to answer your question, well, not just to add on to what you were saying there. But what has led us to this particular situation? I mean, you know, as a consumer, you hardly ever think that one day we might have, you know, a shortage of chickens, of all things. What's brought us here?
Yeah. So I think, you know, what we need to understand as a country is that we are not self-sufficient. So there is that 20% gap that the imports fill in terms of supplying the demand for bone-in chicken in this country. So that's number one. And I think that's an important factor, is that to ensure that there's food security, you need the imports. I think the additional why you have imports, exactly what's happening now, is to keep local price in check, so that you don't have a situation where you have the local guys just going mad with pricing. Now, we've already seen in a space of 9-10 months, we've already seen an increase in poultry of at least 10%. So what is that doing to the lower income South African consumer? So they are now, when they go into the store, looking and saying, well, fine, you know what, we're going to have to buy oil, we're going to have to buy maize. Those are important to us now. But when it comes to their protein, they're looking elsewhere. So they're looking at the processed meats and not buying the protein they used to, because they just cannot afford it. So I think it's important as a country is that we take this all into consideration, and instead of really working against each other, is how does the imports, local guys work together to ensure that there's always food security. And I think something we must remember as well is that as an association, obviously we don't have the full detail of it, but we do hear that there is an AR situation, which is avian influenza, breakout in local poultry. But we don't know the extent of it. But now, if you look at Europe, where Europe markets have been closed for imports for over a year because of AR, is that if that does affect the country, and if that is happening, then you're going to have a food shortage around poultry. And then you're going to need the imports to be bought in to supply the demand. So I think we need a balance here. I think it's time now for the local poultry sector to work with imports. And how do we ensure food security for the South African consumer?
Mm-hmm. Okay, so you're looking for a balance. Are you conceding that there was dumping taking place to a certain extent?
No, I don't believe there was any dumping. And I mean, the evidence showed that there was no material injury. So we're very keen to have a look at the details and work through that report. But you know what? I mean, I need to ask the question. The local guys have been screaming, crying about dumping. But let's understand that the EU market, which is probably our biggest market that we import from, has been closed for over a year and a half. I mean, how can there be dumping if you look at the countries like Denmark and Ireland, they've been closed? I mean, how do you justify and say there's dumping when these markets are closed? So I think one needs to have a look at the fine detail here now, and I think you need to take that narrative out of the press, where obviously there's a lot of lobbying happening about dumping, and always sort of going back to imports. I mean, it's absolute nonsense. I mean, they talk about quality of imports. In fact, import product is, and I will say this, is at a higher standard than what we have locally. So, you know what, this narrative and the drum they've been beating for the last 10 years is over. And I think this is good evidence of it.
Okay, so Paul, the suspension will last 12 months. What do you hope for after that?
So there's a lot of work to be done now. I think, obviously, as I said, is that we need to have a look at the final RTEC report made to the minister. We need to look into that. We also need to see, and I'm sure this is from the minister's perspective, we need to have a look how the economy changes in a year's time. We don't know. We don't have a crystal ball. We don't know what the situation is. If you look around the world, price of food price is sky high. I mean, it's a supply and demand. We need a favorable rand-dollar situation. So I think we need to take all these variables into account. We need to have a look down the line on how this affects trade. And obviously, closer to the time, start talking with the minister in terms of what the way forward is. But for the moment, we have the relief for 12 months, which I think is fantastic. And obviously, we'll deal with these issues as we move forward now.
All right, just a quick one. I just want to confirm something that you said. If you can confirm for me that you're saying, listen, imported poultry is of a higher standard than our own poultry.
Yeah, and I'll go on the record for saying that. So if you have a look, what we call port of entry. So if you have a look as our agricultural department, which is known as DALOD, if you have a look at the state veterinary regulation to import food into this country, is of a huge standard. And as an association, we have always been saying is that we seek equivalency. So the checks and balances that happens for us to import meat into this country, why is it not happening with the local producers? So local producers and through their lobbies groups are always pointing fingers at imports. And I'm telling you now that the regulations are so stringent of bringing food into this country, it's impossible for bad product to come through. I mean, I asked the question if there is any product that needs to be destroyed, which often happens in our case. which is not allowed to enter the country. I asked the question, how often do local producers actually destroy products? So, yeah, I'm quite happy to put on record and say that our product is good.
Paul Matthew, thank you so much for speaking with us from the South Africa Meat Importers and Exporters Association, talking to us about what's transpired. Of course, the suspension of anti-dumping duties on poultry imports.